Tamara Kaldani. I'm from Georgia originally, and I work as an international expert in the data protection and privacy field. In the digital age where we all live in, it's very important to have the rights not only offline but also online. And the technological developments, progress around us, of course, requires that we have the same rights and we can benefit from the services, we can have access to those services, protect our interests, ensure that there are some safeguards provided where we can realize our rights, including having access to our own information, request somebody to delete or restrict processing of our data, express ourselves online as well as offline. So all those rights are very important nowadays because no matter where operating in the offline or online environment. That's why protection of the digital rights and protection of privacy and data protection, which is not absolute right, but at the same time is a right that is connected to other rights as well, including like right to non-discrimination, freedom of movement, freedom of development. It's very important, and we see the growing needs from the side of citizens to ensure that there are some protections and safeguards provided, and we see also the positive developments from the side of regulators and the governments to develop the data protection laws, to develop digital codes or other legalistic acts that will create the environment where we can have a balanced approach, where the equality, access will be guaranteed and people will be much more protected, including from cybersecurity and other risks. In the data protection field, the first international document, this is Council of Europe Convention 108, was developed in 1981. But before, like after World War II, we saw the development of some legislation at the national level, and then we received this convention. Before that, there were other resolutions by the international organizations, but since 1981, a lot has changed. But the Convention 108 really established the first generation rights and also obligations. When the Convention has identified that there are important actors like data controllers and data processors, it could be from the government as well as private sector, and then they have certain obligations because they process data about individuals. Then, of course, there was a development, and then European Union developed a directive, which was mandatory, which was targeted to the European Union members, and then they developed their own legislations with much higher standards than we have seen in 1981 convention, and then after GDPR. From 2016 and after update of the Convention 108. Now we have modernized convention. Then we receive the third generation, let's say, data protection rights and principles. But still those basic principles that we agreed upon in 1980s, like lawfulness, proportionality, data minimization, data quality, accuracy, security are still important and valid. But third generation principles also include privacy by design. It also includes more transparency towards the data subject. So people have to know, because we cannot cope with all data controllers. We are not aware of every organization that holds and stores or processes our data. That's why transparency becomes more important. So they are transparent and they explain to us why they're collecting our data, why they're using our data, and also accountability principle, which puts on the controllers and processors the burden of demonstrating that they comply with the data protection laws. So the third generation, let's say, principles, as we call them, are much more tailored to the realities that we have now and provide more protections and more balanced approach to individuals. And we have seen the so-called GDPR effect After adoption of the GDPR, enforcement of the GDPR, we see that in different parts of the world, more and more jurisdictions are considering either updating or adopting the data protection legislation. There are more than 165 countries now with data protection laws. And what is good is that they share these common principles like lawfulness, proportionality, data minimization, although there are some differences based on the culture, based on the state of development of the state and challenges it could have. Some are more robust, some are less, but still this is the positive development, because we as an individuals, we travel now, our data online travels more than we do. That's why we need to be protected no matter where our data is located and no matter where we travel, because data belongs to us, and then protection should be guaranteed no matter in which jurisdiction I'm currently staying. I think that in the international and many national regulations and laws provide the sufficient ground to say that there is a common understanding that some data, because of its sensitive nature or because of its other type of nature, like biometrics or genetic data, because they're unique and they are for whole life. Like, you cannot change your biometrics. You may change your passport number, you may change your phone, but with biometrics it's very hard to change anything, right? So there are certain data, including like health data or political opinion or religious belief or philosophical belief. This kind of data needs more protection because it's more sensitive, and individuals should have more control over certain type of data. I can easily share, for example, my name and last name with when I go to a hotel or when I get services, but not everybody needs to know certain data about myself, including health or political opinion, because this is individual choice with whom I'll be sharing, and this is right to autonomy, right, to identify with whom and what I will be sharing. That's why Convention 108, GDPR, as well as many laws provide categories of data, so like ordinary personal data, which includes a lot, starting from name, ending with bank account number and telephone number, IP address, and everything. And then under these personal data, they also discuss special categories or sensitive data as a separate, let's say, category or categories of data which require more protection and more safeguards, including separate lawful basis and legal basis for processing this kind of data. For example, if for ordinary data you can have just an ambiguous consent for processing sensitive data, and you need explicit consent. In some countries, for example, in Georgia, we require written consent, so it's more explicit and documented when you can process ordinary data based on the consent that I will provide just with nodding or affirmative action. I think that the international practices and regional practices and instrument provide sufficient grounds to understand what could be meant under the special categories of data or sensitive data, as you wish to call them, and then also provide some guidance how you can regulate protection and provide more safeguards. Yeah, there are basic principles, starting fairness. You have to be fair when processing personal data. You should not discriminate people, right? Lawfulness, which includes that whatever you do with personal data, it should be legitimate, lawful, and at the same time there should be a legal basis, either contract, either public interest, either some provision of the law or my consent based on which you are allowed to use the data and process it in different ways. Transparency, I mentioned this as well, and by transparency we don't mean that data is available publicly. No, we mean that data subject, individual, who is identifiable and whose data is processed, is aware about the purposes of the data and about the organizations that use individuals' data. Then there is a data minimization principle, which means that you should collect as minimum information as required for this particular purpose. Purpose limitation principle. You cannot collect data and then decide why and for which purposes you will be using. In advance, you should know, because otherwise, if you don't have predefined legitimate purpose, then you won't be able to ensure that the data minimization. And then when you have collected the minimum data for the legitimate purpose, you should ensure that this data is of good quality, that it's not false, and it's adequate, updated. Because if you process all data, then it means that you may not grant certain services to individual because you don't have updated information. Then it comes to the storage limitation principle. You cannot collect my data and store forever or use forever. There is because it's a purpose, this purpose has some certain limitations, and after this purpose is reached, in a reasonable period, you should either destroy this data or delete based in which form you collect them. And security of the data is also very important, right? You should process it and store it securely so it's not accidentally or on purpose accessed by the third parties who have no legitimate grounds. And then, as mentioned, this new principle of accountability, which means that it's not me as an individual who should be like proving that or challenging how my data is processed, but you as a organization, public or private, you should be demonstrating proactively that you follow all these principles, and then that you have lawful basis, and then everything is that there is a consent or there is a provision of the law on which you rely during the processing. Those basic principles, I think they're really basic, not hard to implement, frankly speaking, and everybody who wants to process data should, at any stage of processing, during collection, use of this data, especially during the publication or making public, this data should follow those basic principles. And it's, I think that those, in some countries we don't have, for example, principle of transparency or accountability, but when it comes to the lawfulness, data minimization, quality, storage limitation, and security, I think that all data protection laws provide the same principles, and that's why it's very important to follow them on each and every step of processing activity.